I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Hern.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for hosting this important hearing. It's been a long time coming. Let me be clear that unemployment fraud is not a new issue. However, no one here can deny that since the start of the pandemic, the number of fraudulent claims has skyrocketed. I know I'm not the only one here who has experienced this firsthand. Now, I first shared my story during a roundtable hosted last year by my Republican colleagues on this very topic. From their lack of action, it is increasingly evident that the Democrats, my Democrat colleagues, aren't grasping the scope of this issue, so let me show you. So this right here is a box, 27-pound box that I had my staff go dig out of storage, had my folks back home dig out of storage, and it represents, from March 2020 to April 21, 789 fraudulent claims on an employee base of 324 employees that my family business had happen to them. Just 14 months. And yes, as the ranking member said, this was prior to the current administration. But that should make it all the more important of why we need to investigate the fraud that's going on across America. The American taxpayer does not care who's in the White House. They want to know where their taxpayer dollars went, and did it go to not any Americans at all? Did it go to places like India and elsewhere around the world, as we knew what went on? These 789 fraudulent claims were of people that never worked for me, ever. In 25 years of business, had never worked for me. And had we not done due diligence on every single claim, they would have been paid out. Now, I will tell you, when you look at this, we also had people who had been continuing to work that got 1099 saying they were not working. And yet we still do not want to have an adult conversation about what really went on with hundreds of billions of dollars of fraud across this country in the UI program. And so when we talk about this, I really want to get to the idea and the thought of why we can't have, and why we haven't had, I think some of you have mentioned this, that the closer we can do this, and I know that one of you all mentioned that we should have these conversations while we're doing the programs and recognize that when you're really just passing out hundreds of billions of dollars, some would argue trillions of dollars in the time that's happened to us in the last 24 to 30 months, that we have a propensity, and when it's federally mandated, that we're going to have fraud. We should acknowledge that, and we should do our job. It shouldn't be political. It should be bipartisan to sit down and talk about where this fraud is at. Now, I will tell you that we know that this unemployment insurance system is deeply flawed. It's been around since 1935. People have figured out how to beat the system. It's happened. We see it. This is a testament to it. Anybody's more than welcome to look at it. You can't take pictures because it has Social Security numbers on it, but you can take a look at them and see what we're talking about. You know, when we look at the issue that we talked about with workers not working, it is a fact that we know that we sent out hundreds of billions of dollars and incentivizing people beyond the time when some states were going back to work with no discernible difference in the outcome of the COVID pandemic. And yet, people in the state of Oklahoma were funding fraudulent claims in places like California and New York, and no offense to my friends, but that's where the largest amounts of, just from the sheer population, the fraud occurred. And I have to answer to my friends and my constituents back home in Oklahoma why it's okay that the United States Congress cannot hold a hearing on fraud and they have to continue to have their taxpayer dollars being paid out in fraudulent claims. Mr. Turner, what motivation do states have to mitigate fraud when the burden of loss falls on the federal government?
Well, first, I think there is incentive. And part of what the department is trying to do is also offer up a policy of getting a 5% return on when fraud is pointed out, and have that fraud returned back. So I think that's part of the incentive I know the department is trying to do, and we concur with that. That's been part of their recommendations because that would help them pursue it a little more vigorously.
So in following up to that, what's been done to hold the most negligent states accountable so that the hardworking people of states like Oklahoma aren't paying the price?
Well, I think the department has really reached out to all states and trying to hold them accountable. I mean, with our work, we really don't care what state someone is in, but when there's fraud that occurs and once it's identified, we work with our law enforcement partners around the country to try to address it.
Any reforms you see we should be doing so that we don't have this happen again?
Well, here's the biggest problem, in my opinion. The biggest problem is that as the OIG, we make a lot of recommendations. And if you look back over the history, even 10 years ago, some of the recommendations that came up this time are the same problems that went unaddressed, whether that be antiquated IT systems or whether it be lack of staff training. Those are things that we've identified. And with this new program that was out with PUA, there were some states that the officers were not trained properly or didn't know, and in some cases they waived that requirement because there was a lack of understanding of how that process worked.
I'd like to thank the witnesses. Yield back.